Good afternoon, and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's nice to have you joining us this afternoon for our talk by Joseph James, whether you're here with us in the building or joining us on YouTube. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you about two upcoming programs here in the McGowan Theater and our new exhibit. On Tuesday, November 7th at noon, retired Lieutenant General Daniel L. Bolger will tell us about his new book, Our Year of War, Two Brothers, Vietnam and a Nation Divided. One brother supported the war, the other detested it, and they fought it together. Joining General Bolger will be those brothers, Chuck and Tom Hagel. On Thursday, November 9th at noon, Chris Matthews of MSNBC's Hardball will discuss his latest book, Bobby Kennedy, A Raging Story. A book signing will follow the program. And we will launch our next exhibit, Remembering Vietnam, on November 10th, Veterans Day, in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery upstairs. This exhibit is a media-rich exploration of the Vietnam War, featuring interviews with Americans and Vietnamese veterans and civilians, and first-hand experiences of the war's events, as well as historic analysis. It's a fascinating collection of newly discovered and iconic original documents, images, film footage, and artifacts that illuminate 12 critical episodes in the war that divided the peoples of both the United States and Vietnam. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events at archives.gov. Check out our website or sign up to get email updates. You'll also find information about other National Archives activities and programs. In 2012, Joseph James started a podcast to go where his curiosity led him, and to explore the origin and often evolving meaning of documents that have made a difference. After 5 years of podcasting, James has now selected a few dozen of these critical documents for his book, Documents That Change the Way We Live. As we know here at the National Archives, documents are not just paper, but can take many forms. The subjects of Professor James's interest are made of paper, parchment, stone, cloth, plastic, and electrons. They cover more than 4,000 years of history, from ancient Mesopotamia to 21st century Rome. And about 1/5 of the documents on the list, I'm pleased to say, are from the National Archives and Records Administration holdings. The documents in our custody that appear in the book are the Declaration of Independence, the Alaska Purchase Check, the Zimmerman Telegram, the 19th Amendment, Albert Einstein's letter to Franklin Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's Thanksgiving Proclamation, the We Can Do It poster from World War II, the Zapruder film, and the Nixon tapes, or rather the 18.5-minute gap. An institution like the National Archives doesn't pick and choose what it takes. We were founded to preserve the records of the federal government, and that mandate means our holdings include both the historic and the mundane. But sometimes the seemingly mundane document may speak to a researcher and lead to a new understanding of historical actions. And I've been referring to documents that made a difference, but more correctly, it's the people behind the documents who made the difference. Professor James made this point in an interview when he said his research helped him realize the importance of individual people for their persistence and vision and occasional mistakes, which profoundly changed so many parts of our lives. Of the billions of pages of documents in the National Archives, so many of them touched people's lives and changed them for better or worse. In our museum galleries upstairs, we display a great many documents that made a difference in history and changed lives. Before you leave today, consider stopping by the Rubenstein Gallery, the public vaults, and the Rotunda, where the original Declaration of Independence resides. Now let's bring Professor James to the stage and find out what documents made his list of documents that changed the way we live. Joseph James is Associate Professor at the University of Washington Information School. He's the author of several books, including Library 2020, and has written a monthly column for American Libraries magazine since 2002. He's a creator and host of Documents That Changed the World, a popular podcast series on the cultural impact of historic documents. He's taught at the University of Michigan, the University of Toronto, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the State University of New York at Albany, and Syracuse University, as well as the University of Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Joseph Janes.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. It is a great honor to be here at the National Archives. Now I'm really glad I put a picture of the rotunda on the cover of the book, so I'm sure that's why I'm here. And I also have a personal connection to the archives. My first real boss, my first dean, is a former archivist of the United States, Robert Warner, who left the archives to become dean of what was then the School of Library and Information Science at the University of Michigan. So I owe Robert Warner a great deal, I owe the National Archives a great deal, and I am absolutely thrilled to be here. I am by nature a storyteller, as any of my students will tell you. And so what I really want to do today is tell stories. Stories that illustrate the roles and forms of documents. Some things you know, some things you might not know, some things you think you know, but you don't really know, and ultimately tell some deeper stories. Before I get to that, I want to establish my credentials. I want you to be sure to understand that when I'm talking about documents, I know what I'm talking about, because that's my office. And in fact, you can see an earlier version of this presentation on the computer in the corner there. There's my coffee mug, there's a banana. This was quite some time ago, but it still looks like that. Things are just all over the place. So I swim in these things. My house looks like this too. I just swim in documents. I'm one of these people who is fascinated by information and documentary things for their own sake, how they evolve, the roles that they take on, and so on. So the stories I want to tell you today talk about those various roles that documents take, the forms they take, things you know and don't know, and ultimately we're going to get to some of the basic elements of the human experience. And where better to start exploring the human condition than here? Yeah. So you say document to people, not anybody here, of course, but you say document to people, and the first word that comes to mind is, ugh. They're just dull, yes? Ordinary, mundane. They are means to an end. This is a sample utility bill from Seattle City Light, which is my power company. And I get the bill, I write the check. Actually, I go online and pay it now. It gets paid. The lights stay on, although the lights went off in my hotel last night. That was exciting. And everything is fine. So most of these documentary forms are very familiar. They're very everyday, and they're just really dull. To most of you, that's a mid-20th century wedding photo of two happy people about to set off together on their married lives. Might be of some minor interest to future historians about the way people dressed or how weddings were carried out, etc. To me, that's my parents' wedding picture. Somewhere in, well, not quite, but somewhere in there is me, or the future potential me. And so some of these things can have quite personal, quite meaningful connections to individuals above and beyond their role simply as documents. But most documents document. I don't really feel like I need to say that at the National Archives, but I just did. They fulfill some personal, institutional, social, or cultural need. That's a copy of my reproduction birth certificate. I do have the original, but I didn't decide to share that. This was the one I got, I think, to get a passport when I was in my 20s. And it's a birth certificate. It's my birth certificate, which nobody gives a darn about, with the exception of me. Sometimes, though, these quite ordinary things can become quite extraordinary. Some birth certificates get more attention than others for a variety of reasons. Now, I'm not going to litigate this one because, right, we've all been through this. In fact, I have a serving platter with this on it, one of those things you get at novelty stores. So when I have parties, I serve, canapes on President Obama's birth certificate. So, yes, you all know about the conspiracy theories. Yes, you all know about the birthing stuff. I think still roughly a third of the American population believes this document to be forged. The Hawaii Department of Health begs to differ. This is, in fact, a PDF copy of the birth certificate, which the Hawaii Department of Health puts on their website to stop people asking for new images to be made of this birth certificate. There is, of course, a vein of conspiracy theory that says that the PDF is a forgery, that the layers of the PDF were incorrectly structured and they don't line up in the correct way, and therefore, right, down that road lies madness. But for everyone, a birth certificate or these other kinds of personal identity documents, things like driver's licenses, marriage certificates, passports, those kinds of things, can make a huge difference, particularly those identity documents. Just think over the last several weeks, several months, how often you've heard the word undocumented. And what that really means. That means that there is some missing or something missing or some gap in a documentary record that prevents people from doing certain things or doesn't enable them to do things that they might otherwise be able to do. So sometimes these quite ordinary objects wind up becoming extraordinary. Here's a few other examples. This is a perfectly ordinary, perfectly run-of-the-mill King James version of the Bible, printed in London in 1853. If the story is correct, it was fetched from the Supreme Court Library on Inauguration Day in 1861 because Abraham Lincoln's possessions had yet to arrive from Springfield. And there was no family Bible for him to be inaugurated on. So they ran, I think the Supreme Court was in the Capitol building in those days. They ran to the Supreme Court Library, opened it up. The clerk of the Supreme Court fetches out the Supreme Court's version of the Bible, and Lincoln is sworn in on it. Hence, it becomes Lincoln's first inaugural Bible. That's a great story. It's probably true, which is even more surprising for a great story. It then was the Bible that President Obama used, and I believe both of his inaugurals, but certainly the first. So this is in the Library of Congress, just for equal time. This is at the Library of Congress. I actually got to hold this once. I got to go over to the Library of Congress and pore through some of their Presidentiana, which was quite extraordinary. This is, in fact, an extraordinary example of an ordinary form. This is the check that purchased Alaska. And it just never dawned on me there was a check. We all knew we bought Alaska, Seward's Folly from the Russians, the whole story. Everybody knows that. But then you just don't think about how do you purchase Alaska? You know, there's no credit card, there's no wire transfers in 1868. And in fact, this was one of my students, Andrew Kyrios. Andrew, if you're watching. Andrew Kyrios took a seminar with me several years ago and wanted to do an episode of the podcast. And he said, I want to do the Alaska purchase check. He and his family had just come back from Alaska. It never dawned on me there was a check. So there's a check, which you can see has been signed and endorsed. There's an endorsement on the back. It's $8 million, which then somebody cashed at the Riggs Bank. Those of you who who are from Washington know the Riggs Bank. And then the money was given in coin. That's where the story ends. I can't track down what happened to $8.6 million in gold coin in 1868. Whether it actually made its way back to Russia or not, I have no idea. But again, a great story. And it's a check that and it's here somewhere. Not here, but here. This is a map, but it's quite an extraordinary map. We all have billions of kinds of maps, and of course now they're on our individual devices. This is well known. This is the cholera map that Dr. Jon Snow, not the Game of Thrones Jon Snow, Jon Snow put together in 1854. Does this have a thing? Oh, it does have a thing. So right around here is a pump. I can't find it on the map, but right around here is a pump. And this is how Jon Snow figured out that cholera was caused. This was the cholera outbreak in the Soho neighborhood of London in 1854. The prevailing theory at the time was that cholera and most other diseases were caused by bad air, the miasma theory. That's what miasma actually means, of disease. And Jon Snow was the person who helped to figure out that it was, in fact, fecally infected water. I won't go into great detail. I did read an entire book about cholera and an entire book about this map. I can just tell you, if you get to pick a way how to die, don't pick cholera. It's not a good idea. But there's a pump that is infected with waste, let's say. And if you went to that pump, if you turned left to go to that pump, your family would die. And if you turned right to go to the other pump, your family would live. And all of these blobs here that you see are deaths due to cholera. So this is, for many people, this is the beginning of public health as a discipline. This is the beginning of epidemiology for the cause of the disease. This is the beginning of geographic information systems for sort of overlaying data onto maps. This is also an example of big data, 1854. Because he's using statistical data about mortality rates. He's interviewing people in the neighborhoods to ask where did people go. He's using friends and colleagues to combine a variety of data sources to create this map that then led to eventually the understanding that cholera is a waterborne disease, not an airborne disease. Most of us have a will. Most of them look better than this. Written up the sides and around the back and all the rest of it. That's Alfred Nobel's will, 1895. That's his third will, which laid out what we now know as the Nobel Foundation and the Nobel Prizes. But he never set up the foundation before he died. The executors of his will found out only after his death that he had named them as executors, and they were supposed to set up some foundation to give away these prizes that no one had ever heard of. And there's no idea why he did it. And okay, there's a slight bequest to one of his friends, a former barmaid. We won't go into that. So the will is terrible, and it should never have been honored. There's no reason this will should have been honored. And there's great stories about Alfred the executors of the will, spiriting his money out in a horse carriage on the way to the Gare du Nord in Paris to try to get it away from the Parisian tax authorities and off to Sweden, where the will might actually be honored. Who says the Nobel Prizes are dull? So that's a will, but a quite extraordinary will that had quite extraordinary outcomes. This is a fascinating example. This is simultaneously record and cause. This is the ticker tape from October 29th, 1929, which was the worst day of the stock market crash. So there's the beginning of the trading day, and there's all the trades. So it is a record of the trades of those days. Not all of it exists, but some of it still does exist. So it records all the trades of that day, but because the volume, 16 million shares were traded that day. These days, billions of shares are traded a day. 16.4 million shares was the largest trading day by a very wide margin up until this point. And the infrastructure, this is old stock tickers, telegraph machines effectively, were unable to keep up with the pace. They just couldn't. They fell behind. Now, they had fallen behind previously, but then prices were going up. And if the ticker falls behind, that's fine because you're making money. But if the ticker is falling behind and share prices are falling, you don't know how much money you're losing, how fast. And there was a second ticker that was meant to give bond prices, but would give updates on important stock prices every 10 minutes. And it was on time, and this was behind, and they were not the same. And so clearly prices were falling, and that more than likely added to the panic. So part of the reason that the stock market went as far down and as fast as it did that day was because people didn't know what was happening. And ignorance was loss. So the panic fed on itself. So this is one of those things that help us to record and also to remember events of a certain day. Things don't have to be famous to be impactful. I'm going to guess none of you, unless you read the book, thank you, by the way. I'm going to guess none of you has ever heard of this or has ever heard of Catherine Brewer. Catherine Brewer was a student at the Georgia Female College, and this is her diploma. She graduated in 1840. This is her diploma. And as far as we know, this is the first diploma ever given to a woman. 1840. 1840. Not Harvard, not Yale, not Oxford, not Cambridge. Women didn't go. But the Georgia Female College did. Oberlin was founded just a year later, and that was co-ed, but Georgia Female College got there first. Catherine Brewer got the first diploma ever issued to a woman, and she got it first because she was first in alphabetical order. You can see it's in pretty rough shape. It's actually made of cloth. It's sewn. It's been through lots of things, as you can see, but there's her name. And as a, this diploma itself didn't actually accomplish very much other than her entry into her acknowledging her her completion of her degree, but as a symbol of the education of women in the 19th century, it certainly stands out. So many of these things help us to record and to remember. To record and to remember an ill-considered war. There's the unlikely duo of Jan Scruggs and Maya Lin, with the original design for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which is just somewhere that way, I think. I'm totally lost. Over there by the Lincoln Memorial. Those of you who've been there know just how incredibly moving it is, how incredibly powerful it is. She was the winning design from an anonymous competition. She was a student at the Yale School of Architecture. This was her class project. She got a B. She got a B. She did okay. She did just fine, but she got a B. And they tried to complicate the design, and the more she tried to complicate the design, the more she put in, the less she liked it, so she took it all out. And other things have been added. There's statues and other things near it that have been added, but the thing itself, and particularly the fact that you can see yourself in the surface of the stone, it couldn't be stone from Canada or Sweden because draft dodgers had gone to Canada and Sweden, so they wouldn't accept stone from Canada or Sweden. And if the stories are correct, the first name should be the soldier whose brother threw his Medal of Honor into the concrete as it was being poured. Help us to remember and record a mysterious and frightening illness. There's the AIDS Memorial quilt at its first display on the National Mall. The intriguing thing about both the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and the AIDS quilt is that for all intents and purposes they are simply lists. In the case of the Vietnam Memorial, it's a chronological list. From the first soldiers killed as a grenade was thrown into their tent while they were watching a movie in the late 50s, to the very, very end, to the Mayaguez incident in 1975. Names occasionally still get added. The AIDS quilt, of course, continues to grow. It's now over 57,000 names. Each panel of the quilt is 6 by 3, which is roughly the size of a grave. And it's one of the great conservation challenges. Among the main purposes of this or any archives is to preserve things. This thing has been laid on the dirt. It's dragged all over the place. It goes outside. It is made of every material you can possibly imagine. It's not just fabric. It's every kind of fabric you can imagine, and I'll let your imaginations go. And it's an extraordinary thing. It's a list, of course, but it has no particular order or structure. When it's displayed just pieces of it. It is now so large at 50,000 panels, it can never be displayed intact again. It would take many hundreds of football fields to be able to display this thing completely, and so it never will be again. Record and remember. Record and remember the recruitment of women, how there was great home front labor solidarity, the empowerment of women during the wartime period, all of which we know from this poster, which is Rosie the Riveter, which everybody knows, which is absolutely false. She is not Rosie the Riveter. That is not a recruiting poster, and there was not labor peace during World War II. All of that is false. Everything you know about We Can Do It is false. That was a propaganda poster that was put up in Westinghouse factories near Pittsburgh for 2 weeks. This isn't quite high resolution enough, but right down here are the dates of posting. And it was only meant to be up for 2 weeks in February of 1943. That is her Westinghouse employee ID badge. So the Westinghouse company, as did most major manufacturers in those days, had in-house war coordination committees, or things called that, which were effectively propaganda committees that were meant to encourage production, meant to keep labor in line, and meant to further the war effort. And posters like this went up in factories all over the country, on every description you can possibly imagine. My other personal favorite of this was one that encouraged shorter bathroom breaks. And the slogan, it shows two guys in the men's room, and the slogan on the poster is, "Killing time is killing men." So this was serious business. They were not kidding. And when our girl here, and there's 2 or 3 women who claim they're the models for it, but there's no definitive idea, because the artist who did this, Miller, rarely used live models in his work. So we don't think we know who she really is. She's rolling up her sleeves and telling people already working to get back to work. She is not calling women into the factories. Rosie the Riveter is not exactly calling women to the factories, but memorializing the fact that women were coming into the factories. Rosie the Riveter was a song. It was written in 1942. That's the sheet music. Norman Rockwell did a portrayal of Rosie the Riveter for the Saturday Evening Post, meant to look like a Titian sculpture of the prophet Isaiah. With her, she's munching a sandwich, she's holding a rivet gun, and she's got a foot on Mein Kampf. It's quite a pose. I'm not showing that to you here because the Rockwell family is notoriously protective of its intellectual property, and I don't need to get sued right now. That one sits in the Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas, the Sam Walton, the Walmart Museum, purchased for $7 million, the original of the Rockwell painting. So our girl here, the We Can Do It girl here, is not recruiting women into the factory, is not a symbol of labor unity, is not a symbol of female empowerment, except she is. She's now Rosie the Riveter. And every time I see this and they say Rosie the Riveter, steam comes out my ears. But nobody cares. The Rosie the Riveter National Trust, there's a little national park out in California, this is their logo. Not Rosie, her, because who knows that? But everybody knows her, right? And nobody quite knows how this happened. She got taken down in 1943, never seen again, for decades. She winds up in a Washington Post magazine article in the 80s. She's on the Smithsonian magazine cover in the 90s. Nobody knows why. And now she's on coffee mugs and postage stamps and T-shirts and tote bags. It's been repurposed 1,000 different ways. You knew everything about that poster the second I showed it to you, except you were wrong. But that's not your fault. That's right. That's the way it happens. So sometimes we forget, and sometimes the documents will actually help us to remember. Sometimes the documents forget. I thought this was silence. So first of all, Rosemary Woods. Those of us of a certain age remember Rosemary Woods, bless her heart, and the Rosemary stretch. Her foot is on the pedal of the dictating machine. This is how she reached for the phone and thought maybe that was somehow how she erased part of the tape. There's her electric typewriter, God help us all. This is 1972. It wasn't Rosemary Woods, because she said she did about 4 minutes, and it wasn't 4 minutes. It is not silence. I always thought it was silence. It's buzzing, and it's really, really annoying buzzing, I can tell you, because I listened to all 18 and a half minutes of it, the things I do for my audience. And we still don't know what it was. Forensic audio investigation continues to this day. There was a new effort just a few years ago to try to uncover what was on it. At the time, there was a commission of forensic audio engineers to try to figure out what happened. They never did figure it out. They know human speech was on the recording. There are changes in the tone of the buzzes that correspond to different electrical outlets it was plugged into at the time. Okay, but that's about all we know. The forensic audio engineering investigation that went on became the textbook for how to investigate magnetic tape issues to this day. And we still have no idea what was there. It was a very ordinary meeting between Nixon and Haldeman in the Executive Office building. It was not the Oval Office, it was the Executive Office building. Let the record show FDR taped, JFK taped, LBJ taped. I'm going to leave it right there. Other presidents may have taped. ... And totally not going to pick up on that. And the funny part about this is the existence of the 18-and-a-half-minute gap was made public. And that, even though it's a stupid meeting, I listened to the whole meeting. They're talking about whether to send Pat Nixon to South Dakota to visit flood victims. They're talking about movies they liked. It's a terrible meeting. But there's very little in that meeting that seems at all of interest. The smoking gun tape, where it became clear that Nixon was in on the burglary, or at least knew about it, was 4 days later. So if there was something they were going to get rid of, why wouldn't it have been that? What was special about this, which we may never know? What was special about this that was worthy of erasure, which makes you think it's something of an accident? Alexander Haig always thought that Nixon was the one who erased it because he was so awful with technology that maybe he was ineptitude did it. Who knows? But it's a mystery, and we continue to try to figure out what the mystery is. Sometimes documents forget. Sometimes they never existed at all. Joseph McCarthy, junior senator from Wisconsin, is dispatched to Wheeling, West Virginia on a cold February night in 1950 to give a Lincoln Day talk to the Women's Republican Club of Wheeling, West Virginia. And he had two speeches. He had speechwriters. He had two speeches ready. One was to talk about housing policy. The other was talking about communism. I think we all know which speech he gave. I have in my hand a list of 205 communists in the State Department. No list. There was no list, and there never was a list. Later, he had the speech entered into the congressional record. That version of the speech had no list. Later speeches, he said he had 57 names. These all came from other things that he kind of purloined from other sources, about 205 holdovers from the Truman administration, who they weren't sure about their loyalty to the State Department, all this business. 8110, right? He kept changing the numbers. It worked because it was made to work. It worked because people believed and were ready to believe. This was a period, 1950, of great paranoia around the Red Menace, where people genuinely seemed to believe that water fluoridation was a communist plot for mind control, and a variety of other things. This thing worked because it was made to work. People were ready to believe, and they believed because they were scared. And scared people believe all kinds of crazy things. I just spent last week teaching a class, and we talked about the War of the Worlds broadcast, 1938. People believed because they were scared and ready to believe. The list never existed. Thousands of lives were ruined by this. Hundreds of people went to jail. Thousands of people lost their jobs. The Hollywood blacklist came out of this. My favorite Hollywood blacklist story was Gypsy Rose Lee. Some of us remember Gypsy Rose Lee. Being a stripper was fine, but she gave some talk to the New York Anti-Nazi League, and apparently that was a problem. So she was off television for 12 years as a result of that. Taking her clothes off didn't bother anybody, but giving that talk was enough to get her on the blacklist. Sometimes documents don't exist. Sometimes they lie. Sometimes they are made to lie. This is the so-called donation of Constantine, a little less familiar to most of us, probably created around 750. The earliest known version of it is 778. It also emerges again in the 11th century. This was a document supposedly written by the Emperor Constantine that after his conversion to Christianity, which said he was no longer worthy as emperor to live in Rome. So he was going to move to Constantinople, later named Constantinople. He was going to move to Constantinople, leave Rome and Italy in the hands of the Pope, who now has all great honor and dignity and, ruling over all the lands of Christianity, blah, 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 blah. Gets to wear the papal tiara, gets to do this, that, and the other thing, and so on and so forth. It's a fraud. It's a forgery. It's clearly not the 4th century. It's at the very most 8th century, but it worked. And that's why the Roman Catholic Church is Roman, because of this fake document known as the donation of Constantine. We make these objects work. We create them to do some sort of work. To do something, to achieve some objective. So all of these things have power. They are powerful objects in that they exert power, and they are objects of power. They come from some desire to achieve something. some of those kinds of powerful forms are quite obvious. Here is, in fact, the 19th Amendment, or at least an image of the 19th Amendment, which is, I asked about this, a single sheet of parchment originally contained within a large bound volume, now separately housed in a custom-made box, matted and sandwiched between two pieces of plexiglass, stored in a specially protected area of the National Archives building, which means that it's not right here, I did ask, and is not pulled for use in the Central Research Room. So the 19th Amendment is somewhere here. It's quite an extraordinary thing to think that that piece of paper enfranchised half a country in 1920, after decades of trying. There's some theory, not supported by much evidence, but that makes it a great theory, that the text of the 19th Amendment was, if not written by Susan B. Anthony, at least substantially shaped by Susan B. Anthony. And if so, those are likely the only words in the Constitution written by a woman. It's not entirely clear. There might be an of here and there that might have gotten stuck in at some point. My grandmother was an Adams. I wouldn't put it beyond, Abigail Adams to have a go if she thought she had a shot at it. But as far as we know, this might be it. So this is an obvious illustration of documents that have power. This is a very interesting combination of power and forgetting. This is Jefferson's original rough draft of the Declaration. This is not the version I almost sneezed on one day. You can ask me about that during the Q&A. Not actually kidding. So this is the original rough draft of the Declaration. And you can see they're scratched out, there's words added. It's not this page, but a subsequent page has a little flap on it that he pasted on. And this is pre-whiteout. This is print another version out on the word processor kind of thing. So this is the original rough draft that went through 86 amendments in the process of adoption at the Continental Congress in 1776. Very little is known about that process. We know that it was in a committee, and then it came to the floor of the Congress, and it was amended at several points along the way, but it is not entirely clear. It is not at all clear who suggested which amendments, including perhaps the most notable amendment is the striking of what is now called the "he has waged cruel war" passage. I think it's 168 words that condemns King George, among all the other condemnations of King George in the Declaration, that condemns King George for his maintenance and support of the slave trade. So it is, for all intents and purposes, striking the condemnation of the concept of slavery from the Declaration. It is frequently believed that if that passage had not been struck, the Declaration would not have been approved. It's worth saying the idea of independence had already been passed on the 2nd of July. This was the Declaration of Independence. So this was the formal document of it, but the concept of independence had already been passed on the 2nd, which John Adams thought would always be the date that was celebrated, because that was the day they decided to be independent, but instead we celebrate the 4th. If you want any demonstration about the power of documents, there it is, that we celebrate the document, not the idea. The document, it was struck, and we don't know quite how or by whom, and 240 years later, we're still contending with that. And perhaps continue to have a great deal to answer for in that regard. But so this thing was made to forget, and if you read the Journal of the Continental Congress, it says the Declaration was passed, period, and the next order of business was the rental of a boat, which somehow feels that something else should have come in between those two, but I can't quite put my finger on what that might have been. Power and forgetting. So there's the Rosetta Stone, which everybody knows, except nobody knows what it says. And I was just interested in what does it say? Well, here's what it says. You are Ptolemy VII. You are a boy king in 2nd century BCE Egypt. And your father, the pharaoh, has just been assassinated by a cabal led by his mistress. These things happen. And the high priests come to you and say, hey, guess what? We want to make you pharaoh. And we want to celebrate your birthday as a holiday, and we want to, venerate you in the temples and this and that and the other thing. And in return, you're going to legitimize us as the power structure of the country, and you're going to say that everything we do is okay. And if you're 14 years old and your father just got killed by a cabal led by the mistress, you say yes. And when you say yes, the decree of Memphis is engraved on giant stelae and sat outside temples for everybody to see. There's actually considerably more to this. This should go up like this and be more down here. We have complete examples of the decree of Memphis, but nobody cares, because that's the Rosetta Stone, the most frequently visited and the most ruthlessly marketed artifact in the British Museum. Everybody thinks it has 3 languages on it. This is how we understood ancient Egyptian. Everybody knows that story. It actually has 4 languages on it, which is what made me interested in this, because otherwise what do I have to say about the Rosetta Stone? When the English captured it from the French, who dug it up during the Napoleonic campaigns in Egypt in the late 18th century, they painted on the side, given by King George to the British Museum, 17 whatever. So basically vandalized it. But now it's historic. So now there's 4 languages on the Rosetta Stone instead of 3, and it's now of historical interest. This thing has lived several lives, first as a rock, then as a decree, then as a forgotten relic of a long since past dynasty, served as the foundation for a fort for the better part of 1,000 years, and now it sits in a case in the British Museum. One wonders where and what it will be 2,200 years from now. So a lot of these things are about power. The power to establish usage of a language. There's Noah Webster, a deeply complicated character, fiercely nationalist, fiercely anti-Jeffersonian, fiercely anti-populist at the end of his life, because he was kind of crazy. And he's the last person to write a dictionary all by himself. And okay, so 1/3 of it was copied from Samuel Johnson, and he made a few things up. These things happen in lexicography. But the reason we spell, in this country, we spell emphasize with a Z, and the reason that dishonor doesn't have a U in it is because Daniel Webster didn't think we should. So he tried spelling reform, and he achieved much more than most people who try spelling reform achieve. Emphasize, dishonor. Blebby, for those of you curious there, what a bleb is a blister. I had to look that up. This is from the editions. These are the last words that made it into his dictionary, so it's interesting to think that bookstore and chunk and enable and duffel. There's lots of words he entered into the language from Native American languages, from Spanish, from a whole variety of other things. But we spell those things because he thought we should. He didn't get to group with 2 O's, which I think is kind of funny. He wanted to spell women W-I-M-M-E-N. Also, I thought that was amusing, but we did get dishonor and emphasize and so on. Documents give us the power to set rules. That's the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. If you have a mental disorder, it's because it's in that book. If it's not in that book, it's not a mental disorder, and you can't get insurance treatment for it, which is why every time this thing gets revised, there's a giant fight over it, because lives are at stake. Particularly about autism spectrum disorder in the 7th edition that just came out a little while ago. In the 2nd edition, very briefly, homosexuality was a mental disorder, right in between voyeurism and pedophilia, just in case you're wondering. The power to how to run a meeting. Henry Martin Robert, a civil engineer, was leading a meeting in Bridgeport, Connecticut, about how to prepare for potential Confederate invasion, realized he didn't know how to run a meeting and he was mortified, so he put the rules down. And that's why we have Robert's rules. He was also head of the Army Corps of Engineers for 3 days until he retired, which smells like a pension scheme to me, but I have no evidence to that effect. Those are the original rules of soccer, which have very little to do with this, but I think he's just kind of adorable, so I threw him in there. These are the original printed rules of soccer. They'd been printed in a newspaper and now pasted in the minutes of the meeting of the Football Association in Britain in 1863. This is what makes the internet work. It's a print document. Sorry, I know that's probably distressing. But that's the Internet Protocol, RFC 791, 1981. It's that print document, yes, and that's a dot matrix printer, that makes the Internet work. Sometimes these things take on powerful roles because of how they're used. They can ingrain ideas that are very difficult to dislodge. This is the Annals of the World, compiled by the Reverend James Ussher in 1850. It's a chronology, drawing on biblical sources and secular sources to try to figure out when the world was created. And according to the Reverend Ussher, it was created on October 23rd, 4004 BC in the early evening. And 30% of the American population believes the world is 6,000 years old. As a silence falls across the room. Some ideas are very difficult. The current scientific estimates are 13.5 billion years. But the Reverend James Ussher said 4004 BC, and a particularly popular edition of the Bible, printed in Britain a few years after this, picked up the chronology and put it in the margins of the Bible, and it stayed there ever since. Some ideas may never be able to be dislodged because, of course, you can't disprove a conspiracy by fact. Some ideas get lodged and then it's hard to get rid of them because they kind of work. I imagine very few of you know about Sir Ronald Fisher and the statistical methods for research workers. If any of you have ever done any kind of quantitative or statistical research, this is where statistical significance comes from. So every time you hear a news report and it says, such and such a study has found such and such a thing, and it's statistically significant, that's because we shall not often be astray if we draw a conventional line at 0.05, a 5% likelihood of making a mistake in a decision like that, and consider that indicates a real discrepancy. He just sort of made that up. And everybody's believed it ever since. So 90 odd years later, 5% is the threshold for statistical significance of every research study you've ever read, every research study you've ever heard of. Thank you, Sir Ronald Fisher. The power to make sweeping unilateral change isn't quite what it used to be. That's Pope Gregory VII, sitting over there on the left. The man with a stick is trying to explain to him why the calendar is out of whack, and they are more than likely celebrating Easter on the wrong day. Julius Caesar established a calendar at the turn of the Common Era, which was just slightly off. It was off by 11 minutes a year, which doesn't sound like much, but fast forward 1,582 years, and it's off by 11 days. So they are, in fact, celebrating Easter on the wrong day. And as I tell my students, in the 16th century, hell is not a metaphor. And if you celebrate Easter on the wrong day, very bad things could happen, particularly if you're the Pope. So the Pope convenes a commission, he asks for input, it's a very, bureaucratic process, and then says, with the stroke of a pen, I am changing the calendar. I am removing 11 days from the calendar, and now it'll be right, and now we'll be celebrating Easter on the right day. This is the Gregorian calendar we still use in this country, we still use to this day. Immediately adopted in Italy, of course, next to immediately adopted in Spain and France, takes another century and a half in Germany, takes another century and 3/4 in Britain, isn't adopted until China until Mao, not in Russia until the Revolution, and still not adopted in the Islamic world and the Jewish calendar because both of those are lunar. The reason it takes the Pope 150 years, or popes, he was gone by that point, the reason it takes them all that time is because of indulgences. This is an indulgence printed in 1454. This is the earliest Western printed document with a date on it. This is printed by Gutenberg. This is what Gutenberg was doing when the Bible was going on in the background. So Gutenberg starts his work in 1452. The Bibles don't come out until 1455, but somebody's got to keep the doors open between 1452 and 1455, because it takes 3 years to print a Bible. So they start printing school books, they print a few other things, and they print indulgences. And you know the story from there. 1517, Martin Luther gets annoyed, hence we have the Protestant Reformation, hence we have the Catholic Counter-Reformation, hence Germany and England are no longer paying attention to the Pope because he's a demon. And that's why the calendar doesn't change, including in America, including in colonial America, until the 1750s, 1760s. And that's just convenience as much as anything else. So this document leads to the fact that the Pope just can't write a piece of paper. Intergravissimus was the bull, the papal bull that he wrote to make that happen. It's an interesting question to ask. Who could change the calendar today and get away with it? People try, because there's all kinds of things wrong with the calendar, like, the days don't match up with the weeks, and every day is a different week of the year, or whatever. This is a great story. That's a votive disc showing the high priestess Enheduanna at worship. She was the daughter of the Sumerian king Sargon, who usurped several kingdoms and merged them together, and people didn't like that. So he appoints his daughter to be high priestess, and that works because the daughters of the king become high priestesses for 5 centuries. And so we know this whole story because Enheduanna wrote. She wrote hymns to temples, to gods and goddesses. And in particular, she wrote one to her goddess Inanna, which actually formed part of her name, Enheduanna. She wrote what we now know as the Exaltation of Inanna, a poem of about 200 lines, thanking her goddess, praising her, and thanking her for the vengeance that she has taken out on some enemy of Enheduanna, whose name we don't know. But we know Enheduanna's name because she wrote her own name in the poem. She refers to herself by the first person. She uses her own name in the poem. And as a result, Enheduanna is the first known author of anything. And she's also one of the first women whose names we know. So 1.5 million days ago, she wrote her name down. That poem was used for 500 years. We have manuscript copies in cuneiform on clay tablets for over half a millennium, lost and then rediscovered. And we know who she was and we know her situation because she wrote. Power. Power manifests in a lot of ways, including the damnatio memoriae, which was an ancient practice of rubbing out your enemies after they were dead. It was not unusual for Roman emperors and Egyptian pharaohs to deface earlier monuments and statues, literally deface, of their predecessors to remove them from history. This is an example of a coin of, I never care if it's Nero trying to get rid of Caligula or Caligula getting rid of Nero. It works either way. Literally defaced so that they will be erased from history. If it ever worked, we don't know, of course, because if it was ever successful, we don't know. So these things can occasionally have the power to erase, to censor, to remove. Sometimes this can be charming. This is a great little story. Thanksgiving is coming. There's Eleanor trying to look happy about Franklin carving the turkey. Franklin Roosevelt takes office in 1933, gets letters from retailers, 1933, letters from retailers saying, hey, Thanksgiving's going to come really late this year. Could you push the date back by a week so the shopping season will be longer? 1933. You thought Christmas trees were appearing early in Costco today. He doesn't do anything, but in 1939, the calendar is the same. Thanksgiving is as late as it can possibly be. So in August of 1939, Roosevelt, at Warm Springs, just hanging out, casually announces to the press that he's moving the date of Thanksgiving, which has always been by presidential proclamation. Washington did it. Lincoln established it to be the fourth Thursday in November, last Thursday in November. Prior to that, it had been in March. It had been all different kinds of days of the week. Lincoln established it, and subsequent presidents left it alone. FDR thought, what the heck, we'll move it back. If you're familiar with the movie Holiday Inn, there's that little animated sequence where the turkey jumps around. That's what this is referring to. That's the jumping around, because now they're fighting over it. The Congress finally settles this in 1941. Note the date of this resolution. December 9th, 1941, the Senate establishes the date of Thanksgiving because they had nothing else to do. And I just think that's hysterically funny. And this charming little map appeared at the time. So for a period of time, different states had Thanksgiving on different days. So I live in Washington. Washington was celebrating Thanksgiving on November 23rd, as was Oregon. But if you crossed the border into Idaho, it was celebrated on November 30th. So this messed up all kinds of things. Family vacation plans, all kinds of things. Football schedules. That's when it hit the fan, was it? Because it was starting to affect football schedules, and that meant something had to be done. A few states, I'm not mentioning any names, a few states celebrated both days. I'm not mentioning any names. I'm not casting any aspersions. I'm just saying a couple of states couldn't make up their mind. So this is a kind of charming, this is presidential proclamation. This is a kind of charming, amusing story about the use of power. Not all of these stories are quite as amusing. I actually saw, so this is a poster that was put up in Seattle. This is the exclusion order for Seattle. I actually was over at the Smithsonian Museum of National History, American History, and they have the original executive order on display. There's a little display about the Japanese internment over there, and the original display, and it's 3 typed pages which look like nothing.
On loan.
On loan, yes, on loan. I know you don't give anything away. I know it's on loan. But there it sits, and it looks like a memo, and thousands of people got evicted and imprisoned by their country because we didn't trust him. So that's a less charming use of history. So apparently there were no great bombshells in the release of JFK documents the other day, although there's more to be seen, as we understand. That's a powerful image, and it continues to haunt us. The fact that so many people were interested in the release of documents the other day about the JFK assassination tells us that this event and this image continues to haunt us to this very day. I want to tell a different story about the Zapruder film. This is frame 312. 313 is the impact. I'm saving you that. The Zapruder film was not shown on American television until 1984. Geraldo Rivera was the first person to show several frames, including 313, were held back by Life magazine because they were in poor taste. They are in poor taste. It shows a president having his head blown off. That's not something everybody wants in their living room. But the idea that that could be suppressed for 2 decades and nobody seemed to care is quite extraordinary in modern-day America. Abraham Zapruder, dressmaker, camera enthusiast, left his movie camera home that morning. We almost didn't have the Zapruder film. It was a cloudy day. He didn't think he was going to get good pictures. The sun came out mid-morning. He went home, got his camera. He stood on a concrete platform with his secretary with her hand on his back because he got vertigo, and he started filming. And he probably had the best view of the assassination because he had a telephoto lens. So he saw it up close and immediately started screaming. And long odyssey follows of he gets interviewed by the news, he goes on television, he's accompanied by a reporter and a police officer. They finally make their way to a Kodak plant that they open in the late evening to get the film developed. He shows it, he goes home, he shows it to his family. The second viewing of the Zapruder film is in his living room. Sells it the next day to Life magazine, on and on it goes. The government seized it as an assassination record under eminent domain. They paid the family $11 million, but the family kept the copyright. So the copyright resides with the 6th Floor Museum in Dallas. The story that this document tells me, though, is about how things get documented. We know there are other photographs of the assassination that have yet to emerge. We know there were other people taking pictures. We know there were other people taking film of that assassination, but they have yet to emerge, if they still exist. It's hard to imagine today that there wouldn't be dozens of filmed versions of something like this if they happened in public, because it is so common to have security cameras and people filming with their cell phones and all kinds of things. We live in an increasingly documented world. And we are now at the point in the second decade of the 21st century where it's almost easy to imagine that everything you do could be documented. The fact that you are here today, those of you who have cell phones with GPS devices in them, you can be tracked. Somebody knows you are here, or they can know you are here. Somebody knows that I was here. Lots of people know that I was here. Hi. Credit card transactions, texts, emails, phone calls. The number of things that you do on a moment-to-moment basis are being tracked. We live in an increasingly documented world, and we as a society are going to have to figure out what that means and how we're going to live in that world. So, fun stuff to end with. Perhaps the ultimate document, and I mean that quite literally, the golden records that were shot off with the Voyager probes 40 years ago this fall, that contain what's known as the sounds of Earth, recordings of music, recordings of voice, recordings of spoken greetings. They tried to get the UN to record greetings, but the UN wouldn't do it, so they got people from the foreign language departments at Cornell. Because Carl Sagan was at Cornell. This was a Carl Sagan idea. Attached copper discs, plated in gold, attached to the exterior of the Voyager probes. And if you don't believe the first Star Trek movie, we doubt they will ever be intercepted. The likelihood that they will be damaged by asteroids is very tiny. It is entirely possible these documents will outlive the species. They are now, one has left the heliosphere, which is the edge of the influence of the sun at the edge of the solar system. So these are the furthest objects of human creation. They are now 14 billion miles away. And it's entirely possible they will outlive us. To me, these are messages in a bottle, sent off in the hope that someday we will be remembered and someday we will be understood. If we're going to talk about memory, you must remember this. I just had to put this in because I love this movie. Letters of Transit from Casablanca. There are no such things as letters of transit. The entire movie is about letters of transit. The first line is about letters of transit. The last line is about letters of transit. They don't exist. All kinds of travel documents. The nearest thing to a letter of transit is something called a laissez-passer, which you give to a new belligerent to get them out of the country. It's a one-way ticket. But you can buy fake letters of transit online. This very obliging gentleman will make fake letters of transit, which look exactly like ones from the movie. It's a delightful story. And I began with family, so I want to end with family. Fanny Farmer, looking somewhat disapprovingly at her student, who's learning to cook. Fanny Farmer went to the Boston Cooking School in the 1890s. She had polio. Her family assumed she would never be married because she had polio, so no one would want her. So they sent her to the Boston Cooking School to learn how to cook. So maybe she'd be a cook. She wound up being such a great student, they asked her to continue to teach. She later took over the school, and then she wrote what we now call the Fanny Farmer Cookbook. She is best known as the mother of level measurements. So the way recipes are constructed today is because of Fanny Farmer. Recipes prior to this point were very vague, they were completely unspecific, but the first 20 pages of her book are how to measure flour, how to measure water, how to do it properly. You see she's got a level cup of flour in her hand. She's leaving nothing to chance. She's the reason we have, in no small part, she's the reason we have the food culture we have today. She's often cited as the first cookbook author who actually liked to eat. And that is my grandmother's copy of the second edition of the Fanny Farmer Cookbook, given to her by her father at Christmas in 1916. Grand or small, famous or personal, it isn't just these documents, it's our connection to these things that make the stories that go beneath the surface come to life. I hope you've enjoyed this. I love doing this. This is my favorite thing in the world. Thank you all very much, and I think we got a little bit of time for questions. We have time for a question because I cannot shut up, as any of my students will tell you. Sir.
Thank you very much for your curiosity for all of us to learn from. The Rosetta Stone is known for the translation for the hieroglyphics, but can you talk about how that was confirmed through other things that were then found or are still being found and anything else that's out there?
So Jean-François Champollion was the French priest who decoded hieroglyphics. He never saw the Rosetta Stone. He worked from a copy. So he never actually had contact with the actual stone. There are three languages on there. There's Greek, there's Demotic, Egyptian, and hieroglyphic. The Greek was for the Macedonians who were actually running Egypt by that point. The hieroglyphics were just an ancient ritual language that nobody actually read. And it's the Demotic Egyptian that was the language of business, and sort of normal Egyptians could read it. There are errors in the Greek. There are spelling errors in the Greek. I mean, it's granite. You can't, like, backspace. So either they were illiterate or they just made mistakes. Champollion decoded primarily around personal names. So it was the cartouche that contained personal names, and he was able to link that up. It then eventually got corroborated by other examples. The beauty of the Rosetta Stone was that it had the same text in all three languages. Other languages, things like Linear B, we still don't know because they don't have simultaneous translations and other things. But it was eventually, I mean, it's now been fairly well established that the translations and transliterations that he came up with were correct. But yeah, he worked from copies. He never worked from the original thing. And the original thing, the British Museum miscatalogued it, what it was, because when they got it, the archivists in the room will appreciate this. When they got it, they rubbed chalk into the inscription so it would stand out more clearly, and then they put wax on top of it to preserve it. So they thought it was basalt for a long time, and then eventually they figured out they just needed to clean it. It lightened up by several shades, and it's granitorite, something like that, some form of granite, because somebody put chalk and wax on it. Oh my God. Ugh, preservation, it's a risky business. Is that it? I think that's it. I'm being given the hook. Thank you all very much for coming.
And folks, don't forget there's a book signing one level up in the Archives bookstore. We'll see you up there in just a few moments.